Hello everybody. Today we're going to start a new unit. We're going to be looking at elements and principles of design. As we're going through this, I'd like you to have your notes, make notes as appropriate, and try to stay with us. All right? Thanks. So we're going to try to keep this as normal as we can make it. We're going to try to stay in our classroom here and do this the same way that we've been doing it the entire year. So if you guys will join with me on the projector here, we're going to be looking at elements and principles of design. Today in particular, what we're going to be looking at is elements of design. Now, elements of design, this may be a term you've heard in art class, if you've had an art class. Elements of design are the individual components that make up a design. Now, in art, this might be a painting or a sculpture. In engineering, we have a slightly different view of designs because we try to make functional things. And of course, while we want to make things functional, we also want to make things that are visually appealing, things that are easy to use, and basically things that bring a sense of joy to the user and are well designed. Apple in particular has been very good at this. They make, well, hardware-wise, relatively average to above average smartphones, but they have very good elements of design. We're going to look at these individual design elements, these 8 that you see here, in detail, and look at how they're used. So the first element of design is just a singular point. This is the most basic element of design. Points don't actually have any dimensions. They don't have length, width, or depth. They just have a location. Now, of course, when we actually make a point in real life, it has to have some physical dimension, but we say that it's small enough that it essentially doesn't have any dimensions. We use this to point out particular locations. This is a stop motion capture down here in the corner, and you can see that the individual points represent the joints, the elbows, the wrist, the neck of the person that they're modeling. A more common element of design is what's called line. Now, you guys all know what lines are. Lines only have a length. They don't necessarily have a width or a depth. We use them for a couple of things. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you see the line in the center of the road. That's defining a boundary. So it's saying one side of this line has one purpose, maybe going north. One side of this line has another purpose, going south. And this line is there to separate them. So it creates an edge. It tells you when one type of thing starts and one type of thing stops. If you contain a shape within lines, it gives you a certain amount of volume. So for example, an individual piano key, one of the reasons on a piano, if you look at it carefully, there's a little space in between all of the keys, in between the white keys. Part of that's mechanical. It makes it work a little bit easier if they're not rubbing against each other. But 2, those individual spaces act as lines between the keys, and this helps to define the boundaries of the key. It tells you where the actual shape and volume of the key is. If you just had a solid white keyboard, it would be difficult to identify where individual keys are. Now, some lines are what we call positive shapes. They're written right on things, like this line on the road. Some lines are implied. So for example, if you see like the star and the triangle in the upper pictures, if you look, there's actually, in between the triangle areas in here, there is no line, but we imply that there's a line there because there's lines above and below it. All right? This creates almost an optical illusion, but it gives you a sense of where boundaries are, even though there's not a physical object there. We use lines of different types in different ways. The human psyche represents, the human psyche associates certain types of lines with certain attributes. We're going to look at those here for a second. Vertical lines are very formal. When you think of skyscrapers and government buildings and things like that, vertical lines are very emphasized. It gives a sense of like power, certain officialness to those types of objects. You see a couple of the other attributes here. It says stability, strength, and these are all the kinds of things that you're going to try to emphasize, if you're a large company or a government or something like that, and that's why you see them in those types of buildings a lot. Horizontal lines, you might say, are just a bit more relaxed. They represent more of a peaceful kind of situation. So they're not trying to be a dominant feature. They're trying to make the users and the people around them more at ease. And you see this especially if you look at hospitals. A lot of hospitals have strong horizontal lines. Churches often have strong horizontal lines. Some office buildings, particularly the type of office buildings for companies that aren't trying to, take over and be a real dominant kind of corporation. A lot of times you see horizontal lines in that type of situation. Diagonal lines, on the other hand, are a little bit more exciting. Probably because we're used to being in areas with horizontal and vertical lines, right? You have bricks and columns and pillars and doorways and windows, and those are all horizontal, vertical lines. Diagonal lines are a little bit more exciting just because they're out of the ordinary. You see this bridge up at the top. There's lots of bridges made with vertical lines and horizontal lines. This particular bridge, the diagonal lines give it a certain design flair to it, if you will. You also see this, I don't think the ancient Mayans were purposefully trying to incorporate design elements, but pyramids are naturally more interesting shapes than, say, like a giant block. If instead of pyramids, the Egyptians would have built bricks, like big rectangular bricks, they probably wouldn't be quite as interesting. And you also see here in this loft area, you have that diagonal ceiling, which makes the room have a certain pizzazz to it. It has a little bit more excitement to it than the room would if that corner was squared off and the room was actually just a little bit bigger. It gives it more personality, if you will. The last type of line that we're going to look at here is a curved line. Curved lines are a little bit more free-form, they're more artistic. In fact, if you look down here on the bottom right, that's an opera house. Opera is an art form. You're trying to look at something that's more creative. So curved lines fit in well there. Probably many of you have actually seen this in Finding Nemo. On the top here, this is another office building. When you look at an office building like this, and you try to say, oh man, what kind of company would put their offices in here? It doesn't look like a bank, does it? Like you'd think, oh, maybe this is where you have like a graphic design company or something more like that. It's a little bit more creative, more free, right? So line and point help define shapes. Now, once you have an object made of lines and points, it has other design elements also. One of these is color. Now, color, we have three characteristics that we're going to want to remember for color. We have the hue. This is what you would think of as the color. All right? Is it red? Is it green? Is it blue? We have value. How dark is it? How light is it? And we have the saturation, which is how intense is this color? Is it kind of washed out? Is it really vivid? We traditionally separate colors into a couple of categories. The most basic one is to think of warm colors and cold colors. So cool colors are your blues, your purples, your greens. I always think of them as like if it's winter and rainy, like what kind of colors are dominating there? Warm colors, you think like summer, right? You have orange, you have red, you have yellow. They're bright. They kind of are the colors of the sun and warmth. Color has a huge impact on design. So some things, if you would just try to imagine them in different colors, when you think of a sports car, what color do you think of? You know, you probably think of like red or yellow or maybe even like a bright blue or something like that. Not very many people think of brown, okay? Color affects how we perceive not only the look of an object, but how we perceive what it's used for. we talked about the value of a color. This is how dark or bright it is. We have a rubber duck here. You see a dark value on the left, a lighter value on the right. We use value. If you think back way to the beginning of the year, we did some sketching, we talked about shading. It helps us to give this sense of three-dimensionalness to what are flat, two-dimensional objects. So you see this is a mock-up of a car interior, and they're using different values, lighter values for things that are closer to you, facing more towards a light source. Darker values you see underneath the steering wheel where the feet go are darker. They're creating this sense of depth in the image. So we had mentioned before that lines and points help to create shapes. There's a couple of different shapes that we're going, well, a couple different categories that we're going to break shapes down into. We're going to talk about geometric, mechanical, and organic shapes. And the key is, when you're doing a design, is to match the type of shape to the kind of sense that you're trying to invoke. So, let me go back. So, geometric shapes, these are your straight lines, regular angles, consistent corners, like a star. Every angle is the same. Every length of the side of a star is the same. These geometric shapes are used mostly to try to illustrate like a clean design. All right, something that's simple, something that's straightforward. You're trying to imply that with kind of geometric shapes. Mechanical shapes, now don't get me wrong, mechanical shapes are often the shape they are because they have to fulfill a certain purpose. But mechanical shapes also imply a sense of complexness. You're trying to make somebody, give them a sense of like, not only just the complexity, but the intricacy of the design. Now, if you took either of these shapes and put them in nature, where we would see more organic shapes, they'd look out of place. For example, if you had a tree and it had equilateral triangle leaves, that would look just weird. Or if you had gear-shaped grapes or something, like it would be almost unsettling, because this is not the kind of shape we try to envision in nature. However, we do take organic shapes and incorporate them into man-made things. For example, if you think of a computer mouse is a pretty organic shape. It's rounded, there's some curves on it, it's not very geometric, it doesn't look very mechanical, it kind of looks like a pear. And the reason for this is actually one of purpose. A computer mouse is made to be held by a human hand. A human hand is very much an organic shape, and it's trying to go and complement the shape of someone's hand. Back when I was younger, I remember that Apple actually made computer mice. This would have been maybe like 20 years ago, that were perfectly round. They looked like hockey pucks. Apple's always tried to kind of emphasize like simplicity in their design, and they figured, oh, what's a simpler design for a mouse than a circle? And they were somewhat popular, but they weren't very comfortable to use. So we have to kind of think of not only what is something going to look like, but we want to think about how is this going to be used, and how does the shape actually affect that? Here are some examples of shapes, and you can just see this is like a futuristic kind of mock-up here, and the shape itself looks futuristic, and you can do this by putting a combination of very mechanical and sharp-looking things with like an organic kind of shape. That's just an example of how you can combine different types of shapes to get different feels. If you've ever seen any of like steampunk art, they combine like organic shapes and mechanical shapes, but they do it in a way where everything looks kind of futuristic while at the same time looking old, actually. So form is the three-dimensionalness of the object. Now, right here on this whiteboard, everything is 2D, right? The whiteboard's flat, it only has 2 dimensions, it has height and width. The whiteboard does not actually have any depth. But by using different shading on these objects, by using different value, we can imply a sense of depth. Now, in real life, we do have 3-dimensional objects. In fact, every object is a 3-dimensional object in real life. And these objects also have a sense of form. So whether it's implied on a 2D surface or is actually existing on a 3D surface, we still call this form. Some form is very geometric. For example, you see pyramids in this building, you see spheres and cylinders. Some forms are very natural looking, and again, depending what kind of thing you're trying to emphasize, you'll go with different forms. So space, what we call space, is the area that both an object occupies and the area that it doesn't occupy. So we say that the positive space is kind of your point of focus. So if you look here, this sphere with the lines on it is a positive space, and the part behind it is a negative space. If you look in this picture of the cafeteria, the tables and the chairs are your positive space. The area around them is a negative space. We're trying to balance positive and negative spaces. If you have too much positive space, you're trying to draw everyone's attention to positive space. And if you have too much of it, everything looks crowded and cluttered and busy. If you have too much negative space, it looks sparse. It's like a museum with a gigantic exhibition hall and one painting hanging in it. And you're like, okay, this is a bit underwhelming, you know? So, we want to try to find a balance between positive and negative space. How much do we need to put in to make something look like it fulfills its purpose and area, and how do we keep from putting too much in to make it look cluttered? All right. Here's space again. You see in this picture, we have the positive space, the buildings on either side, and we have a negative space in the center here. This gives us a little bit of gap between all the positive space, and it helps to kind of spread everything out and give it a little bit more balanced feel. Sometimes the negative space itself helps to emphasize the positive space. So we have this positive space, this opening with the tree and the scene behind it. The negative space, the black wall around the circle, helps to emphasize it. Our last element of design that we're going to look at today is texture. This is implying what a surface of an object would feel like. All right. Some objects are made for people to hold them, some objects are not, but either way, the texture is going to kind of give you a feeling for what the surface should feel like. You're trying to imply something. Now, again, this whiteboard is perfectly smooth. So even though this looks very textured, very bumpy, it is smooth. We can do this by changing the relative values. We change how we pretend that it's reflecting light. So for example, you see the bottom right object, we see the spot of reflection on it's bigger. We're reflecting more light, it looks smooth. The colors on it would be brighter. And if you took the overall average gray color, the bottom right one is brighter than, say, the top left one. When things are rough, the light gets scattered more, it gets absorbed into the nooks and crannies, it looks darker, and we have a lot less regular light and dark patterns on it. Here's a couple of examples. This is a concert hall, and notice the smooth panels. It looks very futuristic, very modern, clean lines in the design there. On the other hand, we have a very rough texture here. This is a building in Spain, and it looks old, it looks very ornate and detailed. So the one on the left were very clean lines, very plain, very modern looking, if you will. The roughness on this one helps to make it look older. And you see that a lot of times. Rough objects people associate with older, smooth objects people associate with newer. Remember, newer isn't always better. A lot of times people think of things that are old as also being very reliable, and a lot of times stronger even. If you think about it, glass is very smooth and very brittle and fragile. A rock is pretty rough, but it's pretty durable. All right. So it depends what you're trying to convey. If you were making, say, a logo for a company that made spacecraft, you might want to think of like a very smooth one. It looks modern, it looks futuristic, it looks advanced. If you were thinking of making like a logo or some artwork for a company that does construction, maybe you think of something a little bit rougher. All right. So those are a couple of examples: smooth and rough, and of course fluffy. And tomorrow, what we're going to do is we are going to look at principles of design. Principles of design are how do we take these individual elements, texture, color, point, line, all of those things, and put them together so that they create an overall design and they complement each other and everything comes together right. All right, so that's going to be tomorrow. If you guys need, this PowerPoint is on your Schoology, so you can get it from there. Please make sure you've got some notes jotted down. We're going to do a little project with these later in the week. All right? All right, take care.